Welcome to the CIPE virtual event, Humanitarian Aid, No Place for Corruption. My name is Michelle Crimes, and I'm a program officer here at the Center for Private International Enterprise and the Anti-Corruption Governance Center. If you give us just a little bit of time, we're going to wait for more guests to arrive, and then we'll be starting off with Frank Brown giving us a bit of an introduction. Frank, I think it's okay to get started.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Welcome everybody to this virtual event that's being put on by the Center for International Private Enterprise here in Washington, D.C. My name is Frank Brown, and I am the director of the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at CIPE, which is what we call the Center for International Private Enterprise. So on behalf of CIPE and the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center, I would like to welcome you to this event, Humanitarian Aid, No Place for Corruption. It's a virtual event featuring 3 humanitarian aid professionals who have experience delivering aid and combating corruption in their organizations. CIPE is excited to host this virtual event on the heels of the launch of our Humanitarian Aid Anti-Corruption Tool. To create this tool, CIPE partnered with humanitarian organizations to develop a training program to give frontline workers what they need to identify and reduce corruption risks that arise in the field. This tool is especially important now, as the COVID-19 pandemic has quickly become the deadliest global humanitarian crisis in a century. Our tool is designed to ensure that frontline humanitarian aid workers are able to understand the practical, financial, and reputational costs of corruption. The focus of today's event is on the unique corruption challenges faced by humanitarian aid organizations. We will explore these challenges and discuss what humanitarian aid organizations can do to combat risk and increase trust in aid projects during the pandemic and beyond. Today's moderator and speakers will help us to understand the context and nuances of addressing corruption in humanitarian aid organizations. Michelle Crimes, a CIPE program officer, will moderate today. Michelle is an attorney specializing in anti-corruption and compliance investigations. She leads CIPE's integrated compliance programming and delivers the humanitarian aid anti-corruption training alongside CIPE's consultants. Elizabeth Liz Folsom is Chief Audit Executive and Vice President of Global Internal Audit and Investigations for Population Services International, or PSI. She oversees 35 global, regional, and country-based auditors and investigators at PSI, and she manages all audits and investigations for 250 donor-funded projects in over 50 countries. She will give us an overview of the specific corruption issues that humanitarian aid organizations face. Mark Webster is the Regional Director for Asia of the Adventist Development and Relief Agency, ADRA. He's a former CEO of ADRA Australia. He has 25 years of leadership experience with faith-based and secular humanitarian aid and development organizations in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. Mark will discuss the difficulties that COVID-19 has presented for humanitarian aid workers and help us to understand the intersection with corruption. And finally, we will hear from Emily Busagel. She is the Deputy Chief Compliance Officer at the International Medical Corps, or IMC, an international NGO delivering medical relief and training programs in areas hard hit by war, natural disaster, disease, and displacement. Emily oversees IMC's internal investigation unit and monitors compliance with relevant laws and regulations. Emily will discuss the tools and systems a humanitarian aid organization needs to combat corruption. With that introduction of our speakers, I welcome you once again to today's discussion on combating corruption in humanitarian aid, and turn the microphone over to our moderator, CIPE Program Officer, Michelle Crimes. Michelle?
Thank you, Frank, and thank you for that great introduction. As Frank has just noted, I'll be moderating the discussion, and we'll be just talking about ways to address corruption within humanitarian aid. I'm really hoping that we can have a wonderful and engaging conversation. And so I'm hoping that those of you who are participating will challenge us with some of your questions and with some of your insight into the topic that we'll be discussing today. So with no further ado, I will turn things over to Liz. Liz, over to you.
Super. Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here today. This is a topic that we all live and breathe and enjoy speaking, although don't enjoy having to be involved in necessarily, but it's important to share information. As Frank mentioned, I'm with PSI. I'm the Vice President and Chief Audit Executive. We have about 45 offices around the world and 5,000 staff. And I'm lucky enough that the organization is invested in good third line of defense monitoring and assurance. So we have 35 staff globally doing audits and investigations. I also manage the Ethics Point hotline. And I'd say we do around, we get about 200 allegations a year, plus or minus, and I'm going to show you some trend information pre and post COVID. Of course, not all of those allegations turn into cases, but it's a good bench line. And if we can look into the next slide, which talks about the year-over-year trends. My CEO, Carl Hoffman, always says that sunshine is the best antiseptic, and we do practice radical transparency. So I'm very happy to be able to share this information with you. I think it's important that organizations understand where they sit on the continuum of these things. You'll see that 2019 is provided as a baseline. That's the blue line. And 2020, of course, our COVID statistics are the orange line. And then the green line is where we are so far in 2021. You'll see that when you take a look at the orange line, overall, we were down about 20% in our allegations. However, that was significant, mainly due to a significant decrease in cases in the March, April, May time period. Of course, we started the remote work mid-March, as everybody did around the world. Offices shut down, some programming paused, then programming started up again, but people weren't necessarily able to get to the fields. So incoming allegations did dip substantially in March, April, and May. But by mid-May, we were starting to figure out how to do remote audits, how to do remote investigations. Programming was ramping up again, albeit in the new normal of new COVID restrictions and protocols. And by August, frankly, our allegations picked up again and just did not let down. You can see from the 2021 green line, Q1 is on par with prior years, with March actually being higher than March in prior years. And April is not on here, but it is continuing to outperform prior years. I think what's happening is that people, we've been living with this for a while. People are back in the offices with a better view to what did or didn't happen the way it was supposed to during the shutdown and remote, and they're raising the hand with concerns. So if we move on, we can share the next slide that talks about some specific case issues. So this is our pre and post COVID trends about types of cases. Now, you may use different categories in how you classify your allegations and your investigations. This is what we've chosen to use. You'll see we have had a big spike in what we call data quality fraud. This is the evidence of the participants who received our services. In the past, we often would have additional staff at our programming sites or service delivery sites, or monitoring teams in the field doing regular and contemporaneous monitoring. That did not happen as frequently during the COVID shutdown and the new normals with travel restrictions and inability of staff to get around. We've also had a big spike in thefts of assets and property, and also conflicts of interest. Perhaps surprising, the financial fraud allegation numbers are going down. I don't think that the financial fraud allegations are actually going down, but the numbers that we're getting in, or I should say, I don't think the financial fraud is going down, but the allegations are going down. Primarily driven by the inability to see physical hard copy documents, perhaps in the speed in which things are being processed, because we are behind on some of our work. I say behind on some of our work or some of the processing, and people I'm really feeling like we need to deliver. We have a real passion and a real commitment for delivering our services to our clientele. And if things had to slow down because of COVID or shift in how we were accomplishing things, we now want to catch up. So sometimes they may not be paying attention to some of the financial. No, we shouldn't say they're not paying attention to it, but they are moving very quickly and perhaps not noticing some of the red flags that might not have come to bear before. Now, if we look at the business processes that are impacted, that's the next slide here. Very similarly, program management. That's our data quality fraud or related issues. Activities expenses. This is typically the per diems or daily substance allowances paid to community workers or participants. And similar to some of the data quality fraud that we're seeing that we're now hearing about people that may not have been paid the full amount that they were entitled to, or maybe they even signed documents saying that they did receive the amounts, but had only received a portion of it and were promised the rest later. This again, one of the root causes seems to be around not having sufficient monitoring ability to do monitoring real time in the field. So now we're finding it as we're being able to send more people out to the field and hearing some of the stories. Also, the procurement. This is typically in the area of conflict of interest, sometimes directed or manipulated procurement. Oftentimes the root cause of this is to be expeditious, but it may also be occurring because there's not as much oversight of the process. In fact, we've actually had a number of procurement frauds come up that have no impact or no collusion with internal employees, but the corruption aspect is the vendors attempting to defraud us. Our processes that require vendor field visits to verify physical existence and capacity haven't always been able to be done due to COVID restrictions. And vendors were selected that didn't even actually exist, and they subcontracted their work to others, and in some cases didn't deliver. And that's when something came up, the red flag was raised. To identify that maybe we were doing business with somebody that we wouldn't normally have selected because we weren't able to do some of the due diligence. Travel fraud's going down, not a big surprise. People aren't traveling. Even in country, there's often travel restrictions. So that's an area that we haven't had to focus on too much. Now, I wanted to share, I know that others are also going to be speaking about what they've done to help combat some of the constraints that COVID has brought, but I wanted to share some of the things that we're doing. We do, of course, have annual code of conduct training. This is online training in multiple languages that's required, and we do track to make sure that every employee does this annually. Global Internal Audit, or GIA as we're called, we also do an ethics point, which is our hotline awareness poll before every audit that we conduct, even when we're doing remote audits. And that often prompts some interesting conversations and awareness with staff, even if they're not fully aware of what ethics point is, they are after they take the survey. We also do anti-fraud training during the first week of most of our audits, or the country-based internal auditor will be conducting it at some point during the year. And we're talking about why it's important to report, the impact of fraud on people's jobs, on the company's reputation, on program efficacy, and why conflicts of interest may be interpreted differently in different locations, but why it is still a problem to the program. Corruption, collusion, et cetera, et cetera. And as you might expect, we often will see a big spike in allegations coming into ethics point right after we've delivered some of these polls or trainings. We also try to have a lot of one-way communication, regular communication, you can see on the next slide. In 2020, we delivered 24 news posts with a total viewership of about 13,000 employees. We also have something called the Red Flag Reporter, which is a newsletter that goes out detailing specific cases that have occurred within PSI and provide some red flags and tips for people, sort of a do-it-yourself check. We don't want people doing their own investigations, but we want them to be aware of how fraud could occur and what the red flags are so that they can raise their hand if they see a concern in their neck of the woods. Similar to when we do trainings, when we send out communications, we often see an uptick in allegations on that particular topic. For example, towards the end of 2020, I did a quick news post about salary kickback schemes and almost immediately got in a few allegations to our hotline, raising some concerns about salary kickback schemes in different countries. So I guess I would just end with what we're doing to try to keep investigations moving. After the shock of not being able to travel wore off, not having boots on the ground, we've done reasonably well doing phone calls, video calls, and chats through WhatsApp, Zoom, or even Skype. We've done tours of facilities and examined paperwork through the video calls. We've even had resources in country send videos of certain site visits or warehouses or interviews. We've been lucky enough to have in-country resources to be able to use our country-based internal auditors or hired local lawyers or even use third-party firms. We do have a few on contract that we're able to call upon when we have a need in country. And then data analytics and technology. Something as simple as comparing inventory usage or counts to the client data to see if it makes sense, if we are seeing the number of clients that people claim that we're seeing based on the usage of the inventory, or geotag data on pictures. One of my personal favorites most recently was using GPS data on vehicles to determine where the activities are actually taking place. Was the vehicle actually parked overnight in the village, or was it at the person's home? Was the village was the vehicle at the appropriate program site during the day where activities and services were supposed to be delivered? And is that consistent with where they were authorized to be doing work? We've run into a few data quality issues where people may not have wanted to travel as far as they were supposed to travel to do the work in the villages that they were assigned to. So they choose other locations a shorter distance away and then come back with the data supposedly from the assigned location. GPS data generally doesn't lie, and we're able to get to the bottom of that. So it's been a fun journey. We've certainly had some challenges in how we're keeping on top of all of these things. And you can see the trends are shifting a little bit in the types of allegations we're getting and the types of fraud that is manifesting. But we've been able to hold our own. We've been able to keep on top of this and feel pretty confident that staff understand that even in our new normal, what the expectations are, how they're supposed to be operating, what our codes expect, and that they're raising their hands when they see something a little out of the ordinary. So I'll end there and look forward to hearing our other speakers and responding to questions later.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was really great. I think I really appreciate sort of the discussion that you had about being transparent about what we're all doing. Everyone has so many questions about this is our challenge. How can we face it? And I think your last slide, which listed all of the ways that you're sort of addressing some of the challenges that we're all really facing, is very helpful. So I hope that we can do a bit more sharing like that. And I appreciate the ideas that you've even given me as we're having this event. I just wanted to remind everyone that we're recording the session. I apologize, I don't believe we started by mentioning that we were recording. And if you have any questions for either Liz, Mark, or Emily, please do use the chat function here. We'll be having the last 20 to 30 minutes to talk about questions and to sort of have a discussion. And I'll moderate by looking at your questions in the chat section. So now that we've heard from Liz and that she's done a great job sort of laying out for us sort of pre-COVID, post-COVID, or post or mid-COVID, COVID-esque new reality. I don't know what to call it just yet. Let me know if you have any ideas in the chat section. I'd like to introduce Mark from ADRA. He will be giving us a little bit of a discussion about some of the challenges that he has faced as well in his role with ADRA. So Mark, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Liz, for that great start to the presentations. You'll find that as I share some of ADRA's experience from the Asia region specifically, which is for us from sort of Pakistan to Philippines and Mongolia to Timor-Leste, that there's quite a bit of alignment with some of the themes and the experiences that Liz shared. So if you can bring up the first slide, thanks, Ben. One of the first points I want to make is that through 2020 and into the start of 2021 in ADRA, we haven't seen an apparent spike in cases of fraud or corruption. But I say apparent because, number one, I think that the conditions mean we have less visibility than normal or previously. And secondly, I think there can be a little bit of a time lag. And as I saw Liz's first chart, I thought to myself, yes, that's probably what I'm expecting is going to happen. Things are, we're seeing sort of the same level of reported incidents or things that need investigating. And there may well be in 2021 an increase, and we just have to watch that trend carefully and not assume that because we haven't seen new types of fraud or new cases or more cases that it isn't there. The other things that I'll talk about a little bit are the disruption that COVID has created and some opportunities as well, but also shifting risk profiles. So in terms of disruptions that we've experienced in ADRA, they pretty much all revolve around access. And by that, I mean the lack of access that pandemics and lockdowns have created in different ways. And so right across the spectrum, we're seeing that kind of challenge. So in terms of the sorts of internal controls or fraud and corruption controls that we have in place, many of those rely traditionally on being able to actually access project sites, on being able to access documents in original copies, on people being present at the same time for procurement meetings and things like that. And that's become much more challenging to do. It has to be done in different ways. And so some of our controls don't function in the way that we would like them to in these circumstances, and we have to come up with alternatives. Audits, very obviously, are more challenging, particularly if, like ADRA, you rely on an international system, and very often audits are being done by people from outside of a given country or an office. And so audits have to be done differently. A lot more remote auditing now, which brings with it its own set of new challenges, but definitely better than delaying audits. Investigations are also challenged, particularly again when you can't get the people who are qualified and capable of doing investigations to the location to do them. And while you can do some investigating from a distance and using Zoom and other means, it's still challenging. And so in some cases, we have to come up with, again, alternative ways of moving things forward. And I'll share a bit more about that in a moment. Training's another area that we've seen challenges in. Particularly in ADRA, a lot of our training was built around face-to-face workshops of various types, and that's great when you can do it, and you can get a lot of in-depth discussion and conversation, but of course we haven't been able to. For example, ADRA was planning a global financial summit, of which fraud and corruption was one of the topics to be addressed. That was planned for 2020 in September, then it shifted to 2021, and now it's 2022. So obviously we have to find other ways of delivering training. And finally, and this shouldn't be underestimated, I think, leadership access is sometimes a challenge as well. The fact that I'm on this call today is an example of that. I'm not the person in ADRA who normally looks after anti-fraud and anti-corruption work, but we lost the person who was doing that job partway through last year, and it takes longer than usual to replace them. And so we have to pick up on some of those gaps. But equally, many of our officers have leaders who are international, expatriate, might be from a neighboring country or from other parts of the world. And in some cases, those people haven't been able to get back to their offices. We have one office, for example, where the country director could not return because of COVID travel restrictions for 12 months. He got back last week after having left in March. And so obviously those sorts of disruptions of access also have an impact on the conditions and the ability to implement the normal sorts of controls that you have. And leadership is one of those. If we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about how we can react to some of these challenges and situations. And I think one of them that I've seen with the ADRA offices throughout Asia over the last 12 months is definitely a willingness and an ability to get creative with finding new solutions to some of these sorts of challenges. So the sorts of things that Liz talked about, using GPS tracking and for different things than it might have been before. Many of our officers were using GPS app for collecting data and tagging the data collection with GPS. Well, that can now be used in other ways to track performance and to make sure that people are where they're supposed to be. Use of social media to create more transparency and to communicate with communities, to let them know how they can make complaints or raise issues if they see them, has been something that's much more common being done now, especially where the organisation can't get staff in there to receive complaints. So more creative use of social media for those sorts of things. When it comes to, say, an investigation that you can't go ahead with because you can't get the fraud auditor into the country, we've seen officers that, since they can't go ahead and do that, they focus more on prevention. So, for example, setting up a new internal audit department that wasn't there before, doing more awareness raising, changing some of their policies to adapt to the situation so that it just becomes a tougher environment for someone to commit fraud in. So that's one way that I think many organizations are reacting to this situation and challenge, and that's being creative and finding solutions. I think risk profiles are shifting, and that's something that is something that we have to keep tracking and looking at. But a couple of examples of what I'm talking about, and I think again we saw it in some of the data that Liz shared, is that there's a definite shift in risk around digital and online systems. So just a simple example. Now, if an office is doing an audit, because the auditor isn't coming, all of the key documents need to be uploaded to a cloud drive, which the auditor can then access and go through. But obviously, you're putting those documents into a place where they could potentially be hacked or accessed. And more to the point, digital documents are not very hard to change. It's very easy to go into a scanned and signed document and make some changes. And so how we deal with those sort of risks, I think, is also a challenge. And that's looking at the sort of risk that comes from within the organization, where staff may be doing the wrong thing, but there's risk from outside as well. And I think we have seen a spike in the sort of scam attempts that are coming into offices, the kind where someone sends an email that appears to be from a senior person asking for funds to be transferred to a bank account, and they're mimicking email addresses. That kind of thing has definitely gone up as there's more and more activity happening online. And people aren't in the same office where they can just walk around the corner and say, hey, did you really send me that email? So definitely that kind of thing is on the increase, I think. But equally, this creates some new opportunities for us. Some of those creative solutions that I talked about around prevention, a focus on prevention, are things that we can probably stick with. They're probably good changes. Some of the new ways of engaging with the community and allowing them to raise issues and lodge complaints, those are good changes. And so I think that like any disruption, there is the potential for change that actually benefits us in the long run if we take it. And those are things we should be looking for. And that's one reason I'm really excited to be partnering with CIPE to pilot this new online training, because it gives us an opportunity to deliver interactive content to our staff in ways that we couldn't before. And that's exactly what we would like to be doing with a disruption like the pandemic. So that's it from me.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark, for actually really sharing some of your creative solutions. So I know that we've had one such question that we'll get to when we come back in the question and answer section about sort of creative solutions. What do we do? And I think you've listed quite a few of them, and those in combination, I think with what Liz talked about, I think is starting to give us a good picture of sort of how we address additional new challenges as we're dealing with the pandemic. And again, thank you, Mark, also for participating. As Mark mentioned, Mark's team in the Philippines has helped CIPE to launch our pilot, which we're very excited about. Really a great team in the Philippines to work with. And so with that, I will move on to our final speaker. Emily, over to you.
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks Liz and Mark for sharing all the examples. It's very similar to what my organization, the International Medical Corps, has experienced over the last year or so. But I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about how to set up a compliance program in humanitarian aid setting, given the unique challenges that we face. You know, as a first point, you know, all of our organizations, I think Liz, mine, and Mark's, are set up differently. We have different regional structures. You know, I think Liz mentioned that she has, you know, auditors in the field, and Mark has audit at HQ. So everybody's compliance structure and compliance function is probably going to look different based on their organization. But there are a couple of things that I think are consistent good practice in the compliance department or function. And so I want to talk through those just quickly here. And, you know, International Medical Corps had the opportunity to really think hard about how it was going to set up its Ethics and Compliance Department, which it set up in 2016. And so they were very kind of thoughtful and very intentional about how it was structured. And so I do want to share a little bit about how we've structured our compliance department, and hopefully that will, you know, give some ideas and spur some questions. So as most organizations we have 3 lines of defense, which includes our first line, which is our managers, our regular internal controls every day, our finance officers, our procurement officers, the people who do the work on the ground every day. We then have a second line of defense in which we've included both our HQ oversight functions. So we have finance and procurement kind of oversight functions at HQ that review different, you know, high value or high risk transactions. And then we also have our Ethics and Compliance Department. And I'll talk more about how our Ethics and Compliance Department is structured. But we think of ourselves as a partner for management, just to help the second line, the review of transactions as they're ongoing, to prevent any issues before they happen. And then we have a third line of defense, which is our internal audit department. And similar to Mark's organization, our internal audit department is located at HQ. So I want to move on to the next slide, which talks about the different elements of a compliance function and kind of the way that chart set it up. The things that are important to have, I think, in a compliance department, in a compliance function, is that the function be documented so that there's no question about what is compliance role versus other lines of defense's role. And this is really important because in the end, everything can be seen as compliance. I mean, anything that you do, you could say, well, are you compliant with your grant requirements to, deliver this medicine? That could be a compliance issue. So you really have to kind of draw a line around what you're considering compliance for your organization and what your compliance department is going to do. So that's really important to document that, and that's often in a charter. And I think along with that, you want an organogram that shows exactly how your reporting lines work in a compliance department. And it's important here that the compliance department be somewhat independent. So in International Medical Corps, that means a direct line to the board. So we're independent of management. And, we work incredibly closely with management, but it's also important to have, the ability to know that you are an independent function. And the other thing in terms of reporting lines that's important is to try to avoid as much as possible competing responsibilities for your compliance staff. So one example, a lot of times compliance staff in the field, and I think probably in all of our organizations, are asked to do due diligence on a vendor, or asked to kind of do a verification visit to make sure a vendor is, a good company to do business with and there's no issues. In cases where that vendor turns out to be a shell company or a company that's committing fraud, and your compliance officer was involved in the front line of reviewing that transaction, that can be an issue for you. So I just want to mention that's also an important role for a compliance department to have. Finally, it's important that a compliance department be empowered. So have the ability to have a seat at the table, talk to management, get management's attentions about issues, about risks. For example, all of the COVID-19 risks that Liz and Mark have talked about, they are changing the way we're delivering programs. So a compliance department has to be able to identify those risks and then provide suggestions to the people who are operating your programs, implementing them on the ground, in order to change that delivery and make it less risky for the organization generally. And also, in order to do that evaluation, you need access to the right information. So like an internal audit department, a compliance department requires that you have access to transaction files, to information, that it's kind of easily laid out for you. So you can actually look at these things and figure out how to support the organization. Finally, all of us in humanitarian aid face similar, I think, corruption risks. A few of them were talked about earlier. There's salary kickbacks, there's shell companies, there's vendor collusion. All of those things, I think you need to look at your profile, where you do business, the types of programs you implement, and figure out, a compliance program that's tailored towards those risks, towards the threats that are faced by that organization where you work. And it may have to be country specific. And I think this should be frequently re-examined. So those are generally the kind of, I think, best practice elements of a compliance function in organizations like the ones that I work in. On the next slide, I just briefly talked about structure, the more in-depth structure, which is, how do you set these things out between HQ and the field? So often compliance functions have two different portions. There's a proactive portion. So this means the proactive measures that you take to monitor compliance with the requirements that you have, and to remediate gaps before they turn into internal investigations. We've talked a lot about internal investigations on this call, and they are an incredibly important portion of our work and something that takes a lot of time. I think everyone would agree. So it's very important to try to catch these things before they turn compliance gaps, before they turn into issues that have to be investigated. So to do that, my organization has set up what they call a field compliance unit, which has individuals who are placed very close to where we implement projects. So in the field, in the countries we work, whose primary role or only role is to monitor compliance with our requirements. So they review procurement files, they do field site visits, they kind of, all the different, they cover all of our most important business areas and do regular reviews of transactions as they're happening to figure out, okay, are you making sure, are you checking your references on all of your employees that you're hiring? Are you doing anti-terrorism screenings on all of your vendors? Is this all happening, as it should, so that we can avoid issues with investigations. The other portion we've talked about, as I said, is reactive compliance, which is an internal investigations unit. IMC does have an internal investigations unit like ADRA and PSI. Ours is based at HQ. Generally, we don't have investigators in the field. We face the same issues with remote investigations as the other organizations, but we've found that it's better located at HQ with periodic deployments to countries that are having issues, because so that you ensure independence from management, and that and in some ways so that you make sure that your country programs don't think, oh, I always have this investigator looking over my shoulder at all times. It's better for them, we've found, to come in and out and to have the ongoing proactive compliance support be given by a dedicated person who's there to really just help the country program and not seen as like an investigator or even an auditor. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about briefly is working with management, because that is kind of very key to a compliance function. You have to closely coordinate with management at all levels of the organization to make sure that what you're doing is actually helping the organization. The worst thing that the compliance department can be is a drag on the organization, another layer of checks and balances that isn't actually adding anything. And that, I think, is the fear of every person in my position, of every compliance manager. And I think in order to do this, there's like 3 or 4 traits that are really important for a compliance function. And I think, first of all, I'd emphasize consistency. So you don't want management in, seeing that you're being very inconsistent about how you're reviewing transactions, how you're doing internal investigations. I think that it can be incredibly frustrating for management when they don't understand what's going to come out of your work and you're not consistent. Another is responsiveness. It's really important that you be responsive to management's needs and you be flexible. So if they need something that you're not providing, or they see a risk area that you're not covering, I think it's really important that a compliance function support management in that way and cover the issues that management wants. And the final thing is transparency. We always talk about transparency, and it's important for an organization to be transparent with their donors and their the people who are providing, the funds for us to do our work. But it's also important that we're transparent within our organization. When there are issues, that we're transparent about them, that we're not seen as some kind of internal investigation body that's only issuing these reports at the end and not working with management during the process. So on this slide, I suggest a couple of different communication touch points that, should be done both formally and informally. So, developing relationships within the organization is really important. And that includes regular update calls with all different levels of management. When you share internal investigation reports, making sure that you're touching base with management before you just send a report out. And then doing gap analyses, suggesting information, or suggesting gaps that you've noticed that might help management, talking to them before you implement new compliance programs, before you roll out new requirements to the entire organization. I think just continuing to have a really close communication with management is important to the success of the compliance department. And I'm going to end there. I think we went a little bit over, but I'm going to hand it back to Michelle, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
There. Thank you so much, Emily. I actually really appreciate your discussion about the compliance function, because I think that becomes such a critical factor when we're talking about this particular issue. And I think when I talk about this with others, there's always that concern about the relationship between HQ and the teams that we're working with who are in the field. And I think you did a wonderful job of explaining in ways that I haven't been able to, but I instinctually understand it. How do you keep that as a good relationship, right? Where someone isn't always like, oh man, here come HQ, right? And I think you've laid out some really great ways that you sort of work with your teams and understand that compliance isn't always necessarily about the gotcha moment, right? It's about working together as a team to sort of keep our organization moving forward and as efficient as possible. So I want to thank all of the presenters for today. You did a wonderful job, and I would like to now open up to Q&A. And if everyone doesn't mind, I will just sort of scroll here through the questions that we've had with a few of them came in, so thank you for that. And I will scroll through and I'm going to read the first one from Malika, which is Malika is interested in getting some insight from all of the speakers about remote auditing and remote investigations. She's interested in learning or hearing about any lessons learned you may have or any advice you might have in terms of conducting remote auditing and remote investigations.
I can jump in with some thoughts, I think, similar to what others have talked about. You know, you have to be creative and you probably aren't going to get to everything. In fact, when we've scoped our remote audits, we have specifically scoped out some things that you just can't really do remotely. We may do a video review of a warehouse, but we're probably not able, you know, we can't do a physical count. So we may not be able to test all of the key controls around something like physical assets or inventory. So we're picking and choosing. We're using a lot of digital document transfer. Thankfully, PSI before COVID had already started with policies that require attaching specific documents to the transaction saved in the cloud that are accessible anywhere. It was helping with our external audits, and certainly now we are using it for our internal audits and also for our investigations. Although, as Mark points out, you know, digital documents can be manipulated, and so you do have to triangulate even more. You're not just relying on one piece of data. You're probably getting multiple pieces of information for high risk or high value transactions to make sure that you really do have the information, and a lot more of comparing information, both for investigations and audits. You can't just look at, oh, this piece of paper supports that transaction. You have to be thinking outside of the box and saying, well, how could they have manipulated it? What 3 other pieces of information or people can I talk to try to validate that many people really were at a training event, or those many meals really were served, or the invoice that says this many nets were delivered, or these many testing kits were administered. How do we actually validate that? So we've had to go several layers deeper, frankly, in getting that information sent to us, and hoping that if anything was altered by the fact that we're getting 4 or 5 pieces of evidence, we would unearth any sort of inconsistency. So I think more evidence. It's also taking a lot longer. Our audits maybe we're done in 3 weeks. Our investigation closing rate tends to be between 4 and 6 weeks on average. Both of those things have started extending out more because of the time needed for getting the documents, asking follow-up questions. So I don't know if those are magic answers, but those are some of the challenges that we've been facing and how we've been trying to grapple with them.
That's a really great question, Liz. I have a question which might be helpful to someone who might have this question. So you mentioned maybe finding additional pieces of evidence. Can you give us so you have an event, you have a sign-in list, right? Everyone who attends in theory virtually signs in, or we somehow have a list of everyone who attended. What might be one additional piece of information that you might try to collect to sort of help substantiate that the individuals who say they attended actually attended?
Well, we ask for pictures of events so that we could even just eyeball, okay, we said that 40 people attended. The picture looks like only 20 were there or 100 were there. Also, we're asking for phone numbers, fully recognizing that people share phone numbers, people change phone numbers. But when we do get a phone number list, we are more and more frequently using the local telecom company to validate that those phone numbers are in fact legitimate and tied to the name of the participant who attended, or at least a family member. We've actually proactively uncovered a couple of different attempts at fraud where staff or others would substitute their phone numbers for people that were entitled to mobile money for attending a conference. And by having that additional piece of information and validating it with the phone company, not just picking up the phone and calling ourselves, which we also do, but having the phone company help us validate it, we were able to actually disrupt several frauds before they occurred.
Great, thank you for that, because I know that even talking with some colleagues who work in other organizations, and I'm sure some people who are here today, there are questions about how do we do this. So I think you've given us some great examples about how you do it in a way that can be very proactive. So thank you. I'll move on to the next question that I have here, which I think is for all of our panelists. And the question is, do you think we need to accept a certain amount of loss or corruption in order to get humanitarian assistance to the people who need it? And in businesses, most stores accept a certain amount of shrinkage or theft. And should we have the same expectation in the humanitarian aid space?
Well, as Emily, I have to say someone named Rico responded to this, which is a great response. To accept such no, but to expect yes. You know, it's hard, you cannot accept any amount of loss, but you can expect it and put in controls in place in order to reduce it as much as possible. I mean, there's in every single industry or work area, there is going to be fraud and loss due to unethical practices. And so I think the idea is not to accept it, but to expect it and to work against it, to mitigate it as much as possible. But the question of whether we operate in a different funding situation than a grocery store, which has a profit and can just write it off. And so we operate in an area where I would say we don't share risk with our funders for losses due to fraud. And so we have to we can't just build it into our profit model. We have to put in place strict controls in order to mitigate it as much as possible.
Mark, did you want to add to what Emily was saying?
I absolutely agree with that. It's never acceptable, but we do know that we have to expect it. And there is a law of diminishing returns on controls. At some point, you're going to be spending more to get that last percentage of protection than what you would be losing by ignoring it. And that's a reality that I think is generally understood. So we never want to send the message that any sort of fraud or corruption is okay. Because actually the message that staff receive, the message that our community partners receive is important as a prevention method. If we kind of knowingly say, oh yeah, well, we know that there'll be something that goes on, that's almost saying, yeah, go ahead and do it. We have to send the opposite message, but we know that we can't spend limitless amounts of money to prevent every last person who wants to misuse the opportunity that they have.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback on that, this is a topic I'm particularly passionate about, and I agree both with Mark and Emily. And we're talking about control environment and risk appetite, right? The control environment has to be incredibly strong, zero tolerance, all the right communication, the culture, the vision, the values, the training, reinforcement, 17 different ways to really make sure it's inculcated and gets through all of the noisy messaging that we get every day with digital and email and all of the other stuff we're busy with. But our risk appetites, and in our funding environment, as Emily very rightly says, our funders generally have zero tolerance and expect us to pay back every penny. And frankly, as an industry, we probably need to be having conversations with them around risk appetite and risk sharing. This is something that's going to take a generation to shift. But we all know fraud happens, and it's how much money you are able to commit in your risk appetite to reducing it, eliminating it, shifting it, sharing it, because we don't have unlimited resources. So we can't have the same amount of controls over every risk. And we have to be very judicious in how we apply those controls to prevent or detect or disrupt the fraud. But it's a conversation that we need to be having with our funders too, right? Because they're accountable to their stakeholders, their governments, their foundation boards on how the money is spent. But we all know we work in incredibly difficult areas. Fraud's going to happen. So how do we share the burden? It's a longer conversation than we're going to have here, but it's an important topic to keep in the forefront.
Great, thank you for sharing that, Liz. We also agree that it's important, and it's one of the reasons that we're happy to have this event so that we can talk about things that we need to talk about in the future around humanitarian aid and our efforts to diminish and decrease corruption, but also to, as we're doing here, sort of share the idea so that other organizations who are present can start understanding some of the challenges that we're all facing. So thank you all for those great comments on the question. I have another question here, which I'll read, which comes from Diminador Gamboa. The question is, what sanctions do you pose for any proven corruption allegation? Does this any way impact the grant or future of humanitarian aid? So I think it's very sort of related to what we're talking about. What happens when you find corruption, and then what impact does that have on future funding?
I'm happy to have a first go at that. Generally speaking, if we can prove fraud or corruption, then that person doesn't continue to work for us in whatever position they were in. So the tolerance is very low. The challenge is that it's often very hard to actually prove. It happens, and we do it, and then those people move on, but not always. And what was the second part of the question? I had it in my mind, but.
That's okay. The second part of the question is then sort of what happens when you find the fraud in terms of how it might impact how you're funded. And I think that's a question that might depend on who your funder is, but yeah.
Yeah, there's no doubt that when you have an instance of fraud, that's not the best moment in your relationship with that particular donor. But it's a much better relationship when you found the fraud and dealt with it in an appropriate way and disclosed it transparently than if you didn't. And I can't think of too many cases in my own experience where we didn't get a good result out of the relationship. In some cases, the relationship actually improves because funders know that fraud risk is out there. And frankly, as a funder, you'd be suspicious of an organization that said it had zero fraud. What you want to know is that when it happens, you'll find out about it and not in a nasty surprise kind of way, and that it'll be dealt with in an appropriate way. So I think in general, you don't lose from being transparent about those situations with your funders, and you shouldn't be afraid to be.
I would agree with that. And in fact, we've had a situation where we had very good relationships with a couple of different funders where we'd had a number of frauds. And at one time, we had a fraud that impacted through our shared cost mechanism. It impacted multiple funders, one of which was new that we had not had to interact with before from a fraud perspective. And they kind of freaked out when we disclosed it to them. They kind of freaked out and they, oh my goodness, and fraud, and how dare you? And the other funders in country came to our support and actually intervened with that funder in country and said, no, this is a good thing. They know how to handle it. They've told you about it. We all know fraud occurs. Don't worry. And as Mark said, worry about the organizations you're not hearing from. But this one goes in the win column in the sense of identified and fixed. So building those relationships is incredibly important. And I agree. I think they come out stronger in the end when you are being transparent.
I think that speaks a little bit to sort of what Emily was talking about in terms of the compliance function. It's not always about the surprise moment or the got you moment, right? It's about sort of how you work through the issues. Because as we've said, we all know that the fraud is happening. The big question is, what do you do to address the problem, right? It's that way with a lot of things in life, not about the problem itself. It's about how you deal with the problem. Emily, I'm sorry if did you want to speak on this issue at all? Okay, perfect.
No, I agree with both what Liz and Mark said. I don't think I have anything to add. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I have a question if everyone here wouldn't mind, because I'd like to sort of talk a little bit about some of the different challenges we've talked about and ways we've addressed them that have sort of come up because of the pandemic. And Mark, you talked about using social media as a way to sort of address some of the potential fraud issues. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about how you're using social media, because I think in this day and age, sometimes people may not have access to, maybe they don't have access to the internet, but maybe they have access to a social media app. So I'm wondering sort of how you've worked with that. I'm very curious to know.
Okay, yeah, I can share a little bit more about that. That example actually comes from the Philippines, where ADRA's team there is often responding to disasters. Philippines is pretty disaster prone. I think in November last year, we had separate disasters 3 weeks in a row. And because of the pandemic, the responses were being done by teams who were in the communities on the ground, and the ADRA team itself was not nearby. So they'd done training and capacity building. There were local teams ready to respond, but ADRA was managing it remotely, which means they didn't have staff on site. And so some of your normal complaint mechanisms aren't there. And so, yes, you're in Asia, so there are more mobile phones than people and more social media accounts per person than just about anywhere else in the world. And so everyone's on social media. So instead of having monitors on site, ADRA just made sure that community members, people who were receiving assistance, were all made aware that they can find out information about ADRA's assistance on a particular social media channel, and they can make direct comments, they can communicate directly, they can report, and there were also anonymous channels available as well. And so usually we use social media just to push out information, one way, promoting what we're doing, but this was a way of actually intentionally encouraging its use to feed information back in, and it did work. ADRA Philippines did receive comments and in some cases complaints from people about some of those emergency responses, and they were able to then deal with them because they had that information coming in.
Oh, that's a really great example of how to use social media, not, as you've said, just to push out the information, but as a way to exchange the information, right? Which is how we all think about using it, but maybe thinking about using it in our compliance function is quite, I think, innovative and useful. I'd like to sort of continue the questions sort of about sort of how we're delivering aid during the pandemic. There was a question, it's a little bit further below, so I'm going to paraphrase, so please excuse me for paraphrasing your question. But the question was about how you sort of deliver training and updates to teams who may be more remote, who do not have access to a computer screen, right? That's sort of, I think, why the idea of Mark's sort of question, mention of social media popped in my mind, because I would like to hear from our panelists how you address the challenge of training and bringing teams who are remote up to speed on policies related to fraud and anti-corruption.
I can talk about what my organization does a little bit. So we have a onboarding training which touches on fraud and corruption, and we do a refresher every year for all of our staff. And we've had to be a little bit more creative with that refresher. We were in the middle of it when COVID hit, and so we had done a bunch of face-to-face trainings. Generally, the refresher training is half online for those people who have the right access, and then a in-person, guided version for when it needs to be done in person. And we weren't able to gather the number of staff together in one single location in order to do those face-to-face trainings in any efficient manner. So that was a big problem for us, and we were sending people out to train people out to the field, the remote field sites, to do those trainings, and they weren't able to get the right access, and so this was really difficult. And so this year, for the refresher that we're going to do in 2021, we've kind of thought a little bit more creatively about different ways we can do it and given more options. So we generally, our refresher training is scenario based. So it's great face-to-face training. It's, what happens, what should you do if this happens? What should you do if this happens? And what we're thinking about doing for this refresher is actually taping a version of it instead of doing face-to-face in the different languages that we need it in, and then distributing that tape to different areas. So we can do it in smaller in smaller groups. There are less people gathering, and we can do it. You know, we don't need somebody to travel every time we're going to give one of these trainings. So that's some ideas that we have. I have to say we're still in the process of implementing them, and I am yet to see these tapes that we're going to present with the scenarios and the NGO actors in them. I'm interested, you know. So, but that's the kind of the ideas that we're coming up with to help us with definitely a challenging situation.
Oh, it's a great way to sort of address the issue. Liz or Mike, have your organization thought of ways to sort of address this? I'm sure you had a way to address it pre-pandemic, but now the pandemic adds another layer. Have you come up with any solutions in your organization?
Nothing really great from us. I think it's a really challenging one, especially when you're talking about people who might be more remote and don't have as much technology access to, say, jump on Zoom or something like that. One of the areas that I think we might investigate a little bit and see if it could work, and we started last year to get some of the equipment and capacity together, is to look at podcasts, because that doesn't require a lot of bandwidth, and it can kind of be accessed whenever somebody wants to, and just listen to through a phone. So podcasts may be a way for us to move that forward. It doesn't have the visual element, and it's not very interactive, but it is a way to get information out there that doesn't require people to have a whole lot of technology or bandwidth.
That's a potentially great solution. Liz?
But yeah, I was just going to say, I don't have any particular silver bullet here either. We've been sending, pre-pandemic, we were sending a CD, literally shipping a CD to the country offices, and they would take it to the field office and deliver it in person, sort of project it and deliver it in person. One of the things that we are moving towards, we're in the middle of refreshing our communications around our hotline and making sure that it has local phone numbers and accessibility. And one of the things we added was a QR code to our posters so that people can scan that and get to a mobile light version of the reporting hotline, rather than having to sit at your computer and type in the URL in a very heavy input form. This is a scaled down version. And sort of picking off of what Mark was saying, one of the things, we have not made much progress on this, but one of the things we're thinking about is adding, if you scan the QR code, a different QR code, you would get to an audio soundbite that gives you the tip of the month or some information around, remember, this is our policy or something like that. That obviously wouldn't be particularly useful and those are more useful for our staff. We haven't figured out what we would do for the posters that are in the field, particularly when you're dealing with a lot of local dialects and language constraints. But it's something that we're playing with to see if it would work. So sort of the podcast idea, but from a QR code that somebody could just access immediately.
I think those are, I know that you both mentioned that they're not sort of silver bullet ideas. However, I think one of the things that maybe many of us are experiencing, and while we're using Zoom and more virtual platforms like this to communicate, we're sort of also returning to the way that what we might consider sort of low tech, right? Sort of ways of going sort of back and using technology that isn't as complex, that is a little bit more simpler, a CD, a podcast. So I think thinking about the whole entire spectrum of technology that we have to help us has, at least in some of the work that we're doing, very useful when you realize that, you could just have a phone call. Sometimes a phone call actually works, and so I think that all of the examples that everyone has, that you've all shared just now, sort of speak to that as well, that there are many ways to sort of address challenges that we're all facing. I have another question here. And I think this one could be for Emily, I think. So this one says, can you provide an example of a program that has changed as a result of the pandemic? And then one way that your compliance or risk management has been modified to fit it?
I think one common change is that we have programs where we do distribution of different items, food items, or other kind of kits, healthcare items, and there have been issues with the gathering that is required at distribution points, too many people in one spot, and therefore these programs, I think, not at our behest, but at the behest of whoever the government or whoever's in charge of that location, has been to have one person collect for multiple beneficiaries. And that's an issue, of course, because you don't have evidence then that that person is actually giving those items to the right beneficiaries, the targeted population. There's a lot of opportunity for an aid diversion there. So I guess one of the things that we've done, and it is tailored to each program, but is ensure that when that person comes to collect it, we have a clear record of exactly what beneficiaries they're going to and a way to contact them to do post-distribution monitoring. So and we've increased. We always have done post-distribution monitoring to make sure the goods are used in the proper manner and delivered to the right populations. But probably we've in different programs we've increased the number of people we're calling and the questions asked in the post distribution monitoring to ensure that we're covering the increased risk of having one person collect goods.
No, that's a really great and direct answer to the question, and I think an overall theme sort of what we've been talking about in terms of managing the risk and verifying is that there's more creativity that needs to happen, right? And then there's sort of more sort of thinking about additional, I think Liz sort of talked about that additional evidence, right? Or how do we have a verification? And it sounds like that's one of the ways that you adapted what you were doing. So thank you for sharing that, because I know everyone is very curious, and I assume that many of the participants here today are interested in knowing answers to these questions. I do not see any additional questions in the chat box. So if anyone has an additional question that they'd like to send through in the next few moments, please feel free. If not, I am very happy to thank everyone, our presenters who are here today. I really appreciate it because I know that we're all very busy, and in the time of the pandemic, we probably all do more than we were actually doing before. So I appreciate you being here. I appreciate the participants who are here as well. CIPE is very keen on working on the issue of decreasing corruption within humanitarian aid, as we've talked about our work with ADRA, and I'm very happy to talk about that more in a different event, and we'll be sure to invite you to everyone here to that event. But if we don't have any other questions, I would like to thank everyone for their time again, and I hope that everyone has a great rest of their day, and hopefully we'll be back soon to discuss this issue more. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.